All right. Hopefully we have successfully switched screens here. I want to start off by sharing some statistics about the disability landscape that you may or may not be familiar with. So let's start with a question. You can answer this in the chat. How many people worldwide do you think are living with a disability? And as a follow-up question, how many people do you think are disabled at birth versus how many people currently have a disability? So I know we are monitoring the chat here for some questions, and let's participate in this webinar and make it a little bit interactive. I'd like to know just what you think. How many people worldwide with a disability and how many people were born with it? We've got some numbers popping up in the chat there, 28%, 20%. Good guesses? Give it just another moment before I reveal the answer here. 24, good guess. 30? We're getting close. Would you be surprised to know that 1 in 6 people, or a total of 1.3 billion people worldwide, currently have a disability? That is recent statistics from the World Health Organization. Now, to counter that, only about 17% of disabled people were born with their disability. So we see disabilities become more prevalent with age. We see people lose eyesight, lose hearing, lose function in other areas of their mobility and cognitive function as we age. But 17% of people are born disabled and have their disability from birth. Now, how this relates to employment, the employment rate for people with disabilities, we have data for EU countries. It's around 50% compared to the employment rate of 70% for people without disabilities. Now, as they mentioned, I am an American. I have statistics from the United States as well. Our statistics are a little more stark. We actually report about 22% of people with disabilities are employed compared to around 65% of people without disabilities. So a greater disparity exists in the United States than in the EU countries. We want to share some statistics from European countries. We have more data, of course, we can share after the presentation as well for detailed statistics around the world. But it does vary country to country. That data collection methods vary, as well as conditions that are considered disabilities in various countries. So our numbers vary when we look at worldwide statistics, but we can reference back to that 1 in 6 or 1.3 billion people total worldwide when we're looking at these numbers. When we talk about disabilities in the workplace, we can't ignore a lot of disability laws. So many laws when it comes to information technology and websites and other systems that we use in our workplaces, they rely on the WCAG or WCAG standard. That is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So you may hear that term referenced very often when it comes to accessibility and disability laws. We do have some reference the main laws you may have heard in many European countries. Of course, we have the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Now, this is signed by 82 different countries, has been in force since 2008, and many countries make reference back to this UN Convention when they have set their own laws for their country. Another major standard that applies very broadly is the EN 301549. This is a bunch of numbers, but this is the European Standard for Digital Accessibility. So this, when it comes to information, communication, technology, this is the standard that applies for making those things accessible to people with disabilities. Again, this is another point of conformance for many countries. They incorporate this European standard into their own best practices for their country. Another one you may be familiar with is the EU Framework Directive on Employment. This is more of a disability rights than an accessibility law. This is a law that protects people with disabilities and many other characteristics from discrimination in the workplace. And similar to that is the UK Equality Act of 2010. Again, this is a broad act that brought together a lot of pieces of legislation from the UK. The Sex Discrimination Act, Race Relations Act, and the Disability Discrimination Acts were all combined to be this Equality Act back in 2010. I know we've got other European countries in our attendance here. I wanted to call out just a few others that aren't on the slide. Ireland has an Equal Employment Equality Act and has also ratified that UN convention. Italy also ratified that UN convention on the rights of persons with disabilities, and they have their own act on accessibility as well. Again, we can provide some different laws and guidance references at the end of the presentation. Broadening the discussion to the worldwide audience, we have a couple of major policies here in the United States. We have the Americans with Disabilities Act. So this, again, prohibits discrimination based on disability, and it covers public accommodations as well as places of employment. So public accommodations are things like public websites of public agencies and companies that do business with our government all need to be accessible under this law. As well as Section 504 and 508 of our Rehabilitation Act. This is for agencies that receive federal funding in some way need to also make their materials accessible to people with disabilities. The major law governing in Canada that many other provinces are modeling after the Ontarians with Disabilities Act. This is a very broad law, requires all organizations in Ontario, regardless of size, sector, industry, they all need to comply with these accessibility and disability inclusion standards. So this is a policy, a law that has been used as an example throughout Canada. And then we have the Australian Disability Discrimination Act, again, preventing discrimination against people with disabilities. And then for some of the other countries, again, that didn't make the list, Tanzania, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, there are all laws preventing discrimination against people with disabilities and laws that affect accessibility of information technology services. So that is a very broad overview, but I know you came here not to learn about laws, but how we can actually make our workplaces more inclusive to people with disabilities. So what I'd like to do now is do a quick poll. I'm going to switch to a poll slide real fast, but here are the responses for the poll. I'd like you to choose from these 5 areas of human resources practices in general, and tell me which presents the most accessibility challenges for you. Is that attracting new candidates to your business? Is that the recruiting and interviewing process? Is that onboarding that new employee and enabling them to do their job? Is it learning and development, training them to take on a new role? And then advancement and retention. So let me move to this poll slide here. It has a QR code and a website if you'd like to participate that way. Otherwise, you can just do 1 through 5 in the Teams chat if that is more comfortable for you. But I would like to know from you so we can focus on the most appropriate area here. I'm seeing some votes already. Thank you. Let's talk about HR practices in all of these areas, but we're going to make sure we focus on where you have the most questions. All right, I'm seeing a lot of votes for attracting new candidates. So that's making sure that we are including disabled candidates in our recruitment process. We can talk about that for sure. Also, onboarding and enablement. So once we have hired a disabled employee, how do we make sure that they are onboarded and enabled to do their job? I think those are the areas where we can focus the most. We will talk about all of these, but thank you very much for voting in the poll. Oh, we're still voting. All right. All right, so I want to spend the next several minutes of this webinar really focusing on accessibility at work. And we are going to go through each of those areas that I talked about and some specific practices that I've seen from companies implementing these practices in their workplaces. But a lot of these things I'm going to talk about very broadly can be grouped under just creating inclusive design in our workplaces and really think about how our processes and our environments are structured to best support all of our employees, to include everyone, regardless of ability or disability. So let's talk about attracting new candidates to the workplace, and especially disabled candidates. One thing that I have seen a good best practice in this area is really diversifying where you are looking for your job postings. So if you're only posting on your own internal website, are you perhaps reaching out to disability organizations in your metro area that may be able to help you with placement services and place disabled employees with jobs that you have available? So really think about how you are reaching out using organizations in your network, as well as considering some of the online resources as well for remote workers. One other best practice I've seen for really creating representation for a company for disabled employees is including disabled people in their marketing materials, in their inclusion statements on their websites. So the things that new candidates look at when they are considering coming to a company, do they see themselves represented in that company's marketing materials, in that company's inclusion statements? Do their diversity and inclusion statements include something about disability as well as race, gender, and other protected characteristics? And then some other best practices for that attraction process is making sure that your job application itself is accessible. So making sure you're not cutting off any candidates at that stage by them encountering software that may be inaccessible, or other various methods of interviewing and applying for jobs. I have seen various software used these days, I'm sure you have too, where candidates do a one-way interview and send that over to their employer. These can actually be problematic for a lot of people that use assistive technologies. So they may encounter that stage of the application process and go no further because they can't use the software that's necessary. So really consider all of the technology that you're using throughout the attraction process and making sure that your candidates are making it to the next stage of actually recruiting and interviewing. So when we talk about recruiting and interviewing, there are a lot of best practices in this area as well. We obviously want to make sure we're providing accommodations for interviews if those are necessary. And even we can go back a step and we can offer accommodations in the job description. So employees know when they're applying for a job that accommodations are available to them during the interview process and throughout. Give the candidates a way to select the interview format that best suits their ability and their technology. So this may mean having in-person interviews or phone interviews or video interviews at the candidate's preference. So whatever is working best with their comfort level and their technology, you may need to accommodate throughout the interview process. Another good best practice for interviews is making sure that information is clear for the candidates about who is in the interview, so including names and roles of all of the people in an interview panel, and also providing the topics or even the questions for the interview in advance. This can help people who, of course, use assistive technology and need to have a readout made of their interview questions. It also can help those with cognitive disabilities to better understand and prepare for a successful interview. We can train our recruiting staff in reducing bias and reducing ableism practices, and diversify our recruiting and interviewing teams to include people with disabilities on the interview panels. All right, so we have successfully attracted and recruited and interviewed a disabled employee, and now it's time to onboard them in the workplace. So there are a lot of best practices here as well. Again, some high-level ones is to make sure that all of those materials that employee needs to do their job are accessible. So this is making your documents accessible, your employee handbooks, your policies, making sure if you have things in PDF or Word document format that those are checked for accessibility, so those can be read by assistive technology. We can also train our managers to support our employees with disabilities as they onboard. So providing both verbal and written guidance on policies, practices, benefits, anything else that employee needs to know, making sure they are getting that information multiple ways so they are able to understand and, again, use whatever technology they need to use to understand it. We can introduce employees to the resources and accommodations available to them within the company as they onboard. So making accommodations a very open practice, not something that employees feel ashamed about asking about, but changing the culture, the way we talk about accommodations, that they are just part of our process. So if you need enablement to do your job, that your company is there to accommodate. We can also introduce our employees to the other resources the company has. I know many of you have employee resource groups specifically focused on disability or neurodivergence or caregiving. So a lot of these areas intersect with disability inclusion and accessibility. So employee resource groups can be great for a new employee to really feel welcome within their company. And then, of course, if it applies to the employee in their situation, offering whatever flexible work arrangements are practical for your company. This may be remote work, this may be flex time. These things can really help people with disabilities manage their daily tasks and whatever doctor's appointments and other things come up. It also helps your employees that are caregivers for people with disabilities to be able to manage appointments and daily tasks. So the more flexible you can be, the better support you can have for your disabled employees. Learning and development. Like I said, this is my area of expertise. I have had a long career in corporate training. I have trained at many companies, lots of different employee groups from frontline employees all the way up to executive leaders. And there's something that we can do, obviously, across all of learning and development for all of our employees, and that is making sure that learning materials are accessible. We don't want to keep anyone from the knowledge that they need to do their job just because we've created learning videos or modules or some of the fun little activities that us trainers like to create. Some of them can be very inaccessible to people with disabilities. So this is, again, my area of expertise, and I would love to work with your learning and development team on creating accessible learning materials. But as well as that, within the rest of your company, your learning and development team can provide other opportunities for people with disabilities beyond accessible training itself. So this is making sure that your reference guides and resources and knowledge bases and all of this important information is available in accessible formats, and that employees are really given a chance to grow on the job. This is a great way to support your employees with disabilities by giving them a stretch assignment, a special project, a trial to try out a new role so they don't have the fear of failure, that they are supported to grow within the company. So these regular training opportunities, regular check-ins with employees, making sure that they are aware of growth opportunities as they advance within your company. All of these are wonderful best practices within learning and development. And then finally, no one I don't think voted for this one, but we do have, once we have disabled employees with us, we want to make sure that they can advance within our company and that we keep them long term. There was a statistic I read recently from a report that most accommodations in the workplace cost nothing at all for the employer or less than $500. So translate that to your currency as you will. But my point is that most accommodations for disabled employees are actually very inexpensive if there's cost at all. And this is a very easy way to retain your disabled employees long term, is by making your workplace really accommodate those different conditions and people that you have. Some more best practices on advancement, retention. Again, these are best practices for all employees, not just our disabled ones, but let's make sure our performance expectations are clear and that employees get regular feedback. Make sure that we are providing accessible workplaces in general. So our facilities, our transportation, our communication to our employees, making sure that those with disabilities can access everything about the company. And then training our leaders, from our frontline leaders all the way up to our executives, on those challenges that disabled employees face. So really using storytelling is a great way to train many levels of the organization on disability. So I found that really making a difference for one of your disabled employees and telling the story to others really can cement your company as someone with best practices for disabled employees and really be a role model for others. So we do want to share some of these best practices and really dive into a couple cases from different companies here. I do want to kind of recenter the conversation that we've had. We've bounced through several HR areas, but I want to talk about the benefits of disability inclusion. So we talked about this from the HR angle. We can create stronger talent pools. When we embrace disability inclusion, then we're getting more qualified candidates for roles. We looked at the employee engagement retention angle. So when employees with disabilities are valued and included, they are more engaged in their work. And then just creating access for everyone. I talked a lot about accessibility of our materials in our workplace and our systems and our processes, procedures that we use. So disability inclusion benefits everyone when we look at the workplace. I've got a couple more points up here, the ones you may not have considered in our discussion. Disabled employees actually bring a lot of diverse perspectives to a workplace and can help you with innovation and problem solving. So people bring different approaches, different creative angles, and really give you some different ideas for solving problems in your workplace when you consider people with disabilities. There are several financial incentives for including disabled people in the workplace. There are many different government incentive programs in many countries for employing people with disabilities. But just in general, companies that prioritize diversity and inclusion see higher revenue, income, and profit margins. We've got many studies that can show us these results as well. And then improving your company's reputation. So customers are drawn to businesses where they see themselves represented. And we go back to that 1 in 6 or 1.3 billion individuals in the world. When we demonstrate that we have a commitment to DEI and especially diversity in disability inclusion, we can all improve our brand, our reputation as a company. So I wanted to share a few cases. So how do we take all of these best practices together and really make sure we are creating a disability inclusive culture? Let's bring it back to a few statistics. Let's guess again in the chat for this one. What percentage of disabled individuals are excluded from the workforce? We talked about this a little, but let's take this worldwide. I have a different statistic for you. Worldwide average, how many people that are disabled are excluded from the workforce? I see a 33% in the chat. 38, 75. We're seeing a broad range here. 47. Good guesses. 65. Seeing some higher numbers. 64. Good guesses. Good guesses. So if we do a worldwide average, we have about 15% of the world population currently living with a disability. Oh, someone asked the clarifying question. What does excluded mean? Apply and can't get jobs or just are not working? I will have to verify with this statistic, which is one in particular it is referring to. But this statistic that I have says over 80% of people with disabilities are excluded from the labor market in some way. So I'm thinking with a number this high, we're probably considering unemployment, underemployment, people who are not finding work that meets their financial needs or meets their abilities. So I would say excluded in some way. And this results in global loss of over $2 trillion a year total. So we're putting it back in perspective with some statistics here as we bring it to the end. I do want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions here at the end of the presentation. I know I have covered so many best practices with you and those case studies from other companies, and we have lots of resources to share at the end as well. But I do want to quickly just some good do's and don'ts, best practices that you can apply across the workplace. These will be shared with you again afterwards, but they are just general best practices like promoting accessibility and open communication, celebrating the diversity of our employees, prioritizing disability inclusion and accessibility throughout our processes. And then make sure that we are not, overlooking the feedback that our disabled employees give us about our workplaces, and make sure we're not dismissing those accommodation requests as they come up. Not assuming that all solutions are going to fit every cause, really working with our employees to create a very inclusive environment that is welcoming and accommodating for all people. So I want to ask you, we can do this one in chat as well. I'd like to ask you, what is your next step? What of all of those practices that I called out with you, implementing some of those different HR practices, maybe establishing employee groups like some of those other companies have done, maybe it's conducting a disability awareness training. So maybe reply in chat, what was one thing that really resonated with you out of this discussion today that is going to be your next step? See a few responses coming in already. Conducting some disability awareness training. This is an important topic, making sure that people at all levels of the organization are aware of disabilities, reduce their bias, reduce their ableist practices. We have improved website for better accessibility. That's a big one, making sure that all of your digital access points are accessible to people with disabilities. Disability awareness, good. Another one for disability awareness training. Yes, often overlooked as part of DEI. There have been other groups within the DEI umbrella that have gotten their much needed focus from time to time, but disability does often get overlooked as one of those diverse groups that we need to pay attention to in the workplace. Awareness to employees at all levels, love it. Yeah, so these are a lot of practices, again, that can affect employees at all levels of your company, best practices that you can implement throughout your hiring, attraction, recruiting, onboarding, learning and development, and employee retention processes. So we have several more resources, and then I do want to make sure that I leave at least a good 15 minutes for Q&A, because I know that a lot of these accessibility practices bring up a lot of questions on how we implement these. So start getting your questions ready in the chat. We are going to open it up for Q&A, but I do have some resources to share with you as you're preparing your questions. Again, we'll share resources at the end of the webinar. I've got some great books that I would recommend for all age groups here. The one in the center, this one actually hasn't been released yet, but it's upcoming. It's a children's book, The ABCs of Disabilities. Disability Visibility. Many people may have heard of Alice Wong. She is a disability advocate, very well known in the space. She has a collection of essays of people with disabilities, their perspectives. And then one that I really like in particular, Demystifying Disability. This one really digs into what might you want to say to people with disabilities and what might you not want to say, and really demystifying what it is about disabilities that make us different and diverse. And it's a really great book on disability allyship. We've got a great article we will link for you from the Harvard Business Review, really digging into disability as a source of competitive advantage. So like we mentioned earlier, companies are seeing the value of DEI, but maybe not including diversity of disability in those conversations of as well. So this article really highlights why we are maybe missing the mark with people with disabilities in the workplace and how we can do that better to create a competitive advantage. A few videos for you as well here. Great TED Talks. There are actually so many TED Talks on creative, inclusive workplaces, workplaces for people with disabilities. There are some amazing talks by disabled people who talk about their experience in the workplace with their disability. These are two great ones that we've pulled out. I know there's a collection of at least 10 of them saved as a playlist somewhere on YouTube that I found. So definitely search for some TED Talks on creating inclusive workplaces. And I think that's the end of the resources, and I am to give it back to Baki for a moment before we get into Q&A. So again, get your questions ready.
Thank you, Brittany. So just before the Q&A, that's the final slide. So that's another hot topic. So we are working on a DEI magazine that we are going to release on first week of June. So if any of you would like to receive this material, we will be sharing with some of our clients. You can go to our website and subscribe. So articles, best practices, resources, and news and updates will be there. And we will be announcing our new global clients who will be starting our DEI program in this first DEI magazine. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Now you may let your questions free into the chat. Anything that you want to ask me about implementing some of these best practices that we've seen, that we've talked about in this webinar. If you want more information on some of those laws or statistics, we will get those resources for you as well. But please, I saved the last 15 minutes or so here for all of your questions about accessibility and creating disability inclusive workplaces. I can't believe I answered all of your questions in 45 short minutes.
Brittany, I'm curious if you have anybody or you has any personal experience about anyone, who has with disabilities and, there's a question that maybe you can answer my question later.
Yes. We've got a couple popping in the chat here. Let me take the chat and I'll come right back to you. So in your experience, what would you say are some of the biggest barriers to inclusion in the workplace? Honestly, I would say the biggest barrier I've encountered is really just people's attitudes. The way that people think about others that may be of a different group than themselves. So there's a lot of resources out there, and we can provide as well on training to reduce biases, to reduce practices of ableism or racism or other isms in the workplace. So I think in a lot of cases, it really just is an attitude shift. And for people to understand why diverse perspectives and a diverse working audience is really valuable to a company. That's why we share some of the statistics that we do to really put those things in perspective for people, can really help change some of the attitudes when they realize how many people out there actually are as a part of that marginalized group and they may not be aware of. So the statistics, I mentioned storytelling as well, is a really good way to help change attitudes, finding that success story within your company of that employee that your accommodations or your flexible work arrangements were able to help, and then using that story to resonate as a training material for the rest of the managers and executives in the company, saying, look at this one small change we did and the difference that it made. So great question there on attitudes. Let me answer a couple more. How does an organization whose physical structure is not accommodating for those with disability make adjustments if someone with a disability applies for a role? That's a good question, and I would say that, of course, there are always going to be situations where I used to do training for a manufacturing facility, and if someone in a wheelchair applied for the production line, there would be certain tasks and jobs that they just could not do with their wheelchair. So some of it may be if you have a disabled person apply for a job, you may need to think creatively. Is there another job or a role that is suited for them within your organization? And then again, there are many programs. Again, a lot of governments have programs for reimbursing employers that make disability accommodations in their workplace. So I know we have such a broad audience here, and I can speak to some of the programs we have in the United States where an employer may need to make an adjustment to their facility and then receive some kind of government reimbursement for doing so, because they have made this change to their physical structure. So that might be another resource for you to look into as well. Good question. Another question from a manager's perspective, when writing job specs and hiring new employees, how can they bear in mind a more inclusive approach to attract candidates from a wider audience? This is a really good one, and a lot of it comes down to simplifying how you write. You can actually open up your job descriptions to a much wider audience by simplifying your tasks down to the most clear communication that you can for those job requirements. You can, I know we do something here in the United States. I'm not sure if every country does, but most job descriptions say something along the lines of must be able to lift 50 pounds and stand for 4 hours a day, and include various conditions on the job. So this is a practice you may choose to use if it's not required by law in your country, but really making it clear in the job description what is physically required of that employee in that environment. So they may, again, apply for a different position, ask for an accommodation as appropriate, but making sure that that knowledge is clear up front. Another good one for people with cognitive disabilities and for learning disabilities, things like dyslexia or dyspraxia, different verbal conditions. Spell out your acronyms and your company jargon in your job description. I know it's all coming from somewhere internal that someone needed to write this, but clean it up to get it in front of a potential candidate. Really, again, simplify, clear writing. You're going to attract more people with the clear description for those with those cognitive disabilities. How can we make disability awareness training sustainable in companies to champion real change? That is a huge question. That is like a not answer in a one response question. I think it's really creating a culture of inclusion around disability, and not just a single disability awareness training that is a one-off. It has to be a pervasive throughout the organization, really a change in attitude for how we consider all of our colleagues, not just those with disabilities, but how we include everyone and everyone's unique and diverse perspective. Let's come back to that one if we have some time. I know other questions are coming in, and that one felt like really large and loaded. I do want to come back to it. More specifically, a team not located on a floor in a building that is accessible to someone in a wheelchair makes it difficult for them to fully participate. Definitely understand. Again, you may need to think creatively, different solutions for making sure everyone is included. So that might mean meetings become virtual. If the physical space itself is not accessible, then maybe we get important information out virtually instead, where everyone can dial in from their own device with their own assistive technology that they need and be able to participate in the discussion that way. And I know that's not the solution for every environment. You do maybe need to have some creative thinking, maybe an off-site meeting at an accessible location that can accommodate all of those employees with those different needs. We have some awareness initiatives for DEI in our company. I would like to ask, do you have any suggestions to make these initiatives sustainable for our talents with disabilities? So we're talking about other DEI initiatives, how we translate that to disabled employees, if I'm understanding the question correctly. I think tying it in, I've seen a lot of actually with the affinity groups and employee resource groups. If you have within a company like a board of employee groups where you've got a representative from each group. I've found that organizations that have this kind of model where employee voices are represented, that they can find, alliances within other employee groups. So you might find you have success with an intersectionality group that looks at angles, of the intersection of race and disability or gender and disability, and really opening up those conversations to people with multiple marginalized identities. So I really encourage you, if you're not thinking about affinity groups, employee resource groups, business resource groups, whatever you call those within your organization, they can be a real strong support for your employees with disabilities and your other DEI initiatives. All right, a couple more questions. How do you see disability inclusion in the workplace evolving? That's a great question. I think as we introduce more and more technology, we have more and more challenges for making things accessible to people that use different technologies, things like screen readers or, magnifiers, people with low vision, low hearing. Everything can be done digitally these days, it seems, and we need to consider how all of the different assistive technology that people use interact with the technology that we use to do our jobs. I say that's probably the biggest movement I'm seeing is just so many things moving online. I started my career as a trainer when I did everything in a classroom face-to-face, and now I create virtual training modules for people, and I have to make sure that those are accessible to people with disabilities. So as we introduce new technology into the workplace, really considering the accessibility perspective. All right. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for all of your participation and all of your wonderful questions. I'm so glad to see so many people interested in making disability inclusion part of their workplace. So thank you so much for being here.